everybody. It's me, Mickey Mouse. Say, you want to come inside my clubhouse? Well, all right. Let's go. Oh, I almost forgot. To make the clubhouse appear, we get to say the magic words. Miska, Muska, Mickey Mouse. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go.
All right, we're back again for the Nervous System Notes Part 4F. What we're going to get into here is we're going to start getting into things like cortical connections and some of the more complex structures of the brain. Start talking about memory, talk about the limbic system, talk about the hippocampus a little bit, and we're ready to rock and roll. So without further wait, let's get it going. The various regions of the cerebral cortex are interconnected by white matter that lies beneath the cerebral cortex. What this means is, although we have talked about all these different regions of the brain, the primary motor cortex, the primary sensory cortex, the visual cortex of the occipital lobe, all of these different things, the prefrontal cortex, all of them are interconnected between each other. So basically they have nerve pathways that kind of connect and run between each other so that there's a constant communication and relationship between all these different things that are going on with your body, all the different stimulus, all the different responses that have to go on. And all of this occurs beneath the cerebral cortex in the white matter. What you're going to find when you do your sheep brain dissection is if you cut that sheep brain in a frontal plane, you'll notice that the cerebral cortex all the way around it is definitively gray, and then concentrated white in the middle is the white. Right in the middle is the white matter. That white matter is running back and forth, weaving between all these different cortex, keeping them interconnected and running smoothly. We've already gone over this example, but this is one of the basic examples that we've talked about. These are where within your brain you have different association areas or cortex that are actually interconnected through the white matter of the brain between each other. So you have the fact that the auditory cortex is attached to the Wernicke's area, which is attached to the Broca's area, which is attached to the motor cortex, which then is attached to facial muscles, so you can speak. So all of these working together are all part of cortical connections, or connections between different regions of the brain. So one thing you also have to know is there's one very, very, very large concentration of these that's called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is what connects the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. It's what allows you to be able to for your body to know, like when my right hand's moving like this, I can grab my left hand to stop it. It's the communication between these two sides that allows things to go on. It's what allows you to walk with a regular pace. Because you know movement of the right leg is controlled by the left side of the brain, and movement of the left leg is controlled by the right side of the brain. So there has to be a communication between the two. So the corpus callosum is that. It's white matter. The corpus callosum in a human brain, if you look down the transverse fissure, you can actually see right in here where the white matter interconnects the two halves, but it's really only concentrated right there in the middle. If you notice, you can see all the way down this section right here, and if the cerebellum weren't here, you could see all the way down through there. So it is, in fact, just connecting the two halves. A lot of you were blown away when I was going through the sheep brain dissections today that I would grab the brain and just kind of pull apart those two halves. Well, all I was doing is breaking the pia mater that lines those two, but allows you to see down within there that corpus callosum. If you're looking in a human brain, the corpus callosum is in fact this interconnected white matter right here. Now this is a big landmark to know for the brain because there's other structures that are surrounding the corpus callosum. So you have obviously the cerebrum, which is right in here. What we're going to get to here in a little bit is the ventricles. You have your cerebellum. All of these things are involved with surrounding the corpus callosum. In your sheep brain dissection, I showed several of you this, but your corpus callosum is actually this white matter right in here that you see. And then it's also located here on this one. It's this right here. So this corpus callosum, this area of white matter right here, and it's actually on both sides, interconnects the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere together. So there's constant communication between the two. And there's actually been studies of people that have had their hemispheres severed, so there's no communication between the two sides. I mean, there's lots of extremely interesting effects that could actually come of that. Now, some regions are also connected with other structures. So believe it or not, there's some cerebral cortex areas in regions of your, the primary motor cortex and things like that, that are actually attached to other structures of the brain that aren't part of the actual cerebral cortex. That means they can be interconnected with this diencephalon, the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the spinal cord, all working constantly together to make sure your body functions appropriately. So I did want to show you that when it happens, when that connection between the left and right hemispheres kind of doesn't exist anymore, and there actually is surgical procedures to cause that to actually be a thing. They can actually surgically separate the left and right hemispheres intentionally for medical reasons. And here's a video that kind of goes over that.
Different than it did before.
7 years ago, Joe had brain surgery to allay the effects of severe epilepsy. His surgeon cut the nerve fibers connecting his left hemisphere with his right. While the operation was a complete success, Joe's unusual case offers an extraordinary insight into the machinery of mind. This fiber system, the corpus callosum, is located midway between the two hemispheres. When it was surgically severed in Joe's brain, the transmission of information between the two hemispheres was halted. Michael Gazzaniga.
What we can do is play tricks by putting information into his disconnected, mute, non-talking right hemisphere and watch it produce behaviors. And out of that, we can really see that there is, in fact, a reason to believe that there's all kinds of complex processes going on outside of his conscious awareness of his left half brain. Joe, I'm going to show you some things. I just want you to tell me what you see. And here we go. You ready? Look right at the dot.
Okay.
Right. Okay, you ready? Look right at the dot.
Grapes.
Good. When Joe focuses on a point, right at the dot, everything to the right of the point goes to his left brain, the dominant hemisphere for language and speech. Look right at the dot. So we can see here that when we flash a word or a picture,
Tree.
Joe is easily able to name it. There we go.
See it.
Close your eyes and let your left hand do a little work here. Okay, what do you got there?
Pan.
Okay, very good. Now, when a word or a picture falls to the left of a fixation point, that information goes to his disconnected right half brain. And as we can see here, Joe is unable to name it. Joe is able to draw the picture with his left hand, the left hand getting its major control from the right half brain. What'd you draw?
Okay.
What'd you see?
Wheel on one side. I don't know where it's on the other.
So even though he can't name it, his left hand is able to draw out the picture of the stimulus of the picture or word that we presented to his right half brain. What did you see?
Saw a hammer.
So just close your eyes and draw with your left hand. Just let it go. It's nice. What's that?
Saw.
Yeah. What'd you see?
Hammer.
What'd you draw that for?
I don't know.
What we have with Joe is just a dramatic example of a neurologic case that really allows you this window into the non-conscious. and how powerful non-conscious processes are at influencing our conscious self, our personal self. What Joe and patients like him, and there are many of them, teaches us is that the mind is made up of a constellation of independent, semi-independent agents, and that these agents, these processes can carry on a vast number of activities outside of our conscious awareness. Even though that goes on, there's some final stage or some final system, which I
So
happen
that
to
kind of
think is in the
shows
left
you
hemisphere,
two things that we
that
talked about,
pulls
believe it or not.
this-
It shows
all of
you,
this information together into
first
a
of
theory.
all,
It
what
has
goes
to
down
generate a theory to
with cortical
explain all of
connections
this-
between the left
all
and
of
right
these
side,
independent
but also
elements.
what goes down when you sever the corpus callosum. You have these things that you aren't being brought to your conscious level, but they are still being absorbed on the subconscious level, and you are still able to access those in some way. It's completely mind-blowing. So the next structure we're going to get into are what are called the basal nuclei. These are additional things that are located in that deep center region of the brain, but what they are is they're masses of gray matter that actually lie underneath the lateral ventricles. These things are complex. They have very specific jobs, but what they do is they're gray matter below the lateral ventricles and lie inside the white matter of the cerebral hemispheres. So it is actually located on both sides, and it's like gray matter within the white matter. What they do is they provide the connections between the cerebrum, the diencephalon, and the brainstem. These are the cerebrum, obviously a lot of the conscious stuff, but then the diencephalon and the brainstem are a lot of that subconscious information. So they function in the subconscious control of your skeletal muscle tone and the coordination of learned movement patterns. What this means is these actually provide things like learned movement patterns like walking. They have the subconscious control of skeletal muscle tone, keeping you sitting upright throughout the day. All of these things are done by interconnecting between the cerebrum and those subconscious centers like the diencephalon and the brainstem. What they do is they're not in charge of starting the movement, but what they do is provide rhythm and pattern. So this is the reason why you're able to walk and swing your arms at the same time, which provides that balance. You're able to stay upright. Your primary motor cortex starts that movement and continues it, but these also control those muscles on the subconscious level to make sure you have a pattern and a gait to them. Looking at a picture of the basal nuclei, you will see right in here, on top of this, that would be right below the lateral ventricles, which we haven't got to those, but we will. And it consists of several parts. So you have like the basal nuclei, you have the thalamus, you have the amygdala, but it's basically a system of connections that allow all of these things to be tied into the conscious and subconscious level. If you look at it from a mid-sagittal cut, you can see again, right in here, this is going to be the corpus callosum right here. So this is tied closely to the corpus callosum. That's where you can see it's actually embedded into the white matter itself. And it looks kind of like a hook type structure. And you have the different sections here. And if you notice, this would be your diencephalon and part of the brainstem, which connects it to the white matter within here, which connects it to the cerebrum itself. So now we're getting into the ventricles of the brain. The ventricles of the brain are essentially caverns in the brain that really their sole function is to produce cerebrospinal fluid, but it's not the ventricles of the brain that actually produce it as much as they store it. There's a structure called the choroid plexus within the chambers or the ventricles that actually their sole job is to produce cerebrospinal fluid. In this class, it's not our task to really get into how they produce it. It's just a matter of, in this class, knowing that choroid plexus actually produces the cerebrospinal fluid. You have essentially 4 ventricles, but 2 of them kind of get grouped together. And the group that they are grouped together is called the lateral ventricles. In previous versions of textbooks, they were called the first and second ventricles, which is kind of deceiving because that appears to have a sequential order to them. But really and truly, the lateral ventricles sit on both hemispheres of the brain, and what they actually do is produce cerebrospinal fluid. And since they're each on equal sides of the brain, it's confusing to call them 1 and 2 because people think that something's produced in 1 and it continues on to 2. So they started calling these lateral ventricles. I don't care if you call the left one the number 1 ventricle and the right one number 2 ventricle, it doesn't matter to me. But they don't actually connect to each other. What they do is they come and connect down into what is called the third ventricle. The third ventricle sits just by the diencephalon, and its job, still the same as the other ones, is it has choroid plexus and it produces cerebrospinal fluid. The fourth ventricle is located just by the pons in the upper medulla oblongata, and it connects the central canal of the spinal cord and the subarachnoid space. So essentially, the lateral ventricles connect down into the third ventricle. So they sit here, and they connect down into the third ventricle. That third ventricle forms down into the fourth ventricle, and the fourth ventricle dumps cerebrospinal fluid into the central canal, which would be that canal down the middle of the spinal cord, and then also dumps it into the subarachnoid space, or what is also called the epidural space, that goes around the brain and around the spinal cord. The cerebrospinal fluid that is produced here is what cushions, protects, and provides nutrients to the brain and spinal cord. Keep in mind that when we were talking about this, when we were talking about the spine, that the cerebrospinal fluid that flows between all of this is continuous between the brain and spinal cord. If you're looking at it here, the ventricles of the brain, you have the anterior view right here. Here's one ventricle, and here's a second ventricle. These are the lateral ventricles, so this could be ventricle 1 and ventricle 2. And if you notice, they both dump down into the third ventricle, which is right here. That third ventricle leads down into the fourth ventricle, which is kind of behind the brainstem and in front of the cerebellum, which then dumps down into the central canal of the spine. Here you have a lateral view, same thing. We have one of the two lateral ventricles, which dumps down into a third ventricle, which dumps down into the fourth ventricle, which then connects to the actual central canal of the spine. If you're looking at it this way, just another view, but this is a cross section instead. Lateral ventricles, third ventricle, fourth ventricle, central canal. This one I find to be very interesting because you can actually see some of the choroid plexus. So right here in this section right here would be the lateral ventricle. The lateral ventricle is going to dump down into the third ventricle, which is right here. Again, more choroid plexus producing cerebrospinal fluid. That third ventricle dumps down into the fourth ventricle with still yet again more choroid plexus to produce cerebrospinal fluid. This is where it gets pretty cool, is the fact that that cerebrospinal fluid then goes down into the central canal of the spinal cord, but also leaves and goes into the subarachnoid space of the spinal cord and around the cerebellum. Here's what's even cooler, is it actually has a flow like a river to it. So once it leaves and goes into the subarachnoid space here, it bathes around the spinal cord, reaches the bottom, which would be like the caudal equina, comes right back up, surrounds the brain, comes around the brain, and back into the ventricle, almost like a recycling system. There are, however, also ways that the cerebrospinal fluid can get down into the grooves and cracks and sulci of the brain, but it's essentially the bathing fluid of the brain and the spinal cord. What this picture here is showing you also again is that flow of cerebrospinal fluid down the spinal cord, around the brain, and back into the ventricles. Alright, so that's where we're going to stop on this particular video. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. Yet again, I can't thank you enough for being the amazing students you are. Have a great night.